Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to another live Ask Elvis. My goodness, I am pumped for this one. I cannot wait. There's so much to talk about, isn't there? Thank you all for joining, wherever you are in the world. As always, I massively appreciate it. I have plugged my mic in this week, so I hope you can hear me. So that's all good. And there is so much to talk about, isn't there? What an amazing race we had yesterday. I mean, I'm so pleased it was an amazing race. First of all, because we all love watching amazing racing, but can you imagine if it had been an absolute bore fest after the wait that we'd had, after the anticipation of building up to it? You can imagine what the haters would have been. They'd have been all over it, but they can't. There's nothing to hate about yesterday. It was amazing. I hope you all agree. Let's say hello to a few people. Lots of people already, all afternoon. People have been chatting on here, which has been awesome. Hello from the USA. That is DK Grins. Hello from Palermo. Where else are we? Canada. Absolutely. Always a bunch from Canada. Hello from Dorset. Peter H. California as well. My goodness. Michigan in the USA as well. Alpha Mays. So many people all over the world. Derbyshire, Virginia, everywhere. Scotland, Germany. I love it. I love it. Thank you all for joining. I really appreciate it. Where do we start? We are going to start with the picture that you all saw in the thumbnail for the video and in the opening holding page. We're going to talk about that incident. I did a video on my YouTube channel earlier on today, trying to explain it as best I could and using the rule book to try and explain how the stewards might have come up with that decision. It's been one of the most polarising decisions that I can remember. I've got a poll that's been running most of the afternoon on here as well, which I'll show you the results of in a minute. And I'm a little bit surprised at, I have to say, but I'll show you that one in a moment. Let's start then with the question, because the question comes from, let me see, where is it? The first question comes from Chip Hines, and he says, in your opinion, did Lewis deserve a 5-second penalty? Wolf makes a compelling argument that he had no choice but to keep his line. So let's get straight into it then. I'm not going to say whether it was right or wrong. I will give you my opinion, but it's one of those that was so close that actually there's a great argument on both sides. I will explain to you my take on it and why I think the stewards gave their opinion and gave the penalty they did. I've done it mostly in that video, so I won't go into too much depth. I think it was the right decision to hand out a penalty to Lewis. And the reason that I say that is because it was a touch and go incident, right? But Lewis was on the inside. Lewis had the racing line. Albon, though, was much faster on much softer tyres and went right around the outside. And the main reason that I'm saying they gave the right decision in giving a penalty was that Alex Albon was just so far ahead. He'd done the overtake and it was his rear wheel against Lewis's front wheel, which shows you just how far ahead they were. In my opinion, that was Lewis not wanting to give up the position, which obviously that's understandable. That's exactly what any racing driver would do, but he could have avoided it. And you could say, well, let's look at this picture. Here it is. You can look at that single frame there and say, well, look, there's a load of space to the outside of Alex Albon. I've seen loads of people say that today. There is some space on the outside. Albon could have gone wider. Well, if you roll this film on, and I can't show you the footage, unfortunately, for rights restrictions reasons, but if you roll that footage on, he does roll out, does move out to the right to the white line, which is the edge of the racetrack. Now, Lewis has got all of this space on the inside. He wasn't on full lock. He could have backed out. He could have taken evasive manoeuvres. He could have given up the place, is what I'm trying to say. Now, let me see. I'm sure all of you already, lots of you are already jumping on this, this argument, because there are two sides to this. Alex Albon put himself in a very risky position by trying to go around the outside. However, he had a much faster car at that stage in the race, and he had got round the outside quite cleanly, quite easily, by quite a great extent. And Lewis, unfortunately, knew he was there. He had a much clearer view of where Alex's car was than Alex did at the point where they made contact, because Alex was already way past Lewis. But Lewis could see the car, he could see how close he was. He had the option to avoid it, but he chose not to, and I think that's the reason. He was predominantly to blame for the collision, which is what the stewards referred to in their ruling, That's why the penalty was given. Yes, it was a racing incident, but I do think in this incident, Lewis was predominantly to blame for that racing incident, and therefore he got the penalty. Let's see. Lots of you, this is just going to be a mixed bag because, as I say, it's polarising. Some of you agreeing, some of you clearly disagreeing. And I'll take both sides. You know, I don't think there's a right and wrong. And this is the point with all of this. There's a really difficult job for the stewards to do in this kind of situation. You know, when you talk about football or tennis with, you know, football with goal line technology where things can be measured using technology and it's a very clear cut yes or no. Is the ball in? Is it out? Is it over the line? Is it not? In this type of situation, it's not like that. You know, this is open to interpretation. And whenever you open anything to interpretation and put humans in that situation to make a decision, they will sometimes get it right, they'll sometimes get it wrong, they'll sometimes have a different opinion to those watching. And the other important point here is they will sometimes have a different opinion to when they maybe saw a very similar incident on another occasion. And that, I think, and you can tell me, is what I think upsets a lot of people, is they want consistency in these decisions. And that's totally understandable. Of course, that's what we want. I think we have consistency to a point, but there's always going to be some inconsistency because it's a human-made decision and we're not relying on measurements or technology. So let's see what you think then. Lots of people, as I say, agreeing. Federico de Liberto says, I agree with you, Mark. At the end, Ham didn't have to be that defensive. Yeah, he's a racing driver, and I'm sure had the roles been reversed, you know, Alex would have desperately tried to hold on to that position as well, and I'm sure he would admit that too. Wish there was a way to compensate Albon, not just punish Hamilton, says Cody Mack. Well, that's another point, right? And perhaps we can discuss this if you want, but should penalties be handed out based on the consequences of a driver's action or just on the action itself? So if you break a rule in Formula One, if you break a driving standard, if you move twice, for example, in the braking zone, there's a clear rule that says you can't do that. If you do that, is that a standard penalty because you broke that rule, or should the penalty reflect the incident or the outcome of that incident? So if a driver that you hit is out of the race, should your penalty be greater than if actually both cars continue and you both get to the end of the race? Interesting debate. I don't really know the answer to that one. It feels, you know, hugely unfair on somebody like Alex at the weekend where he didn't finish the race. I don't know, that was for another reason, but he tumbled down the order and he would have been out of the points probably. But actually the incident was the same, and if they'd bashed wheels and continued, probably the stewards wouldn't have given any penalty at all, I would imagine. So difficult one to get right, I guess, on that one. Penalties on actions, not consequences, says Anko. No, they should be given on the action for a driver, not the consequence. Let me see. Can we look into lap one? The roles were reversed, says Varun Sambi. So the lap one incident was very similar. It wasn't the same by any means. It was very similar, but it was the other way around with Lewis on the outside. And Lewis backed out of that situation, didn't he? But he was nowhere near in the same position as Alex was, i.e. that far ahead. And had he been that far ahead, there's no way Lewis would have backed out of that situation. And when the stewards look at a first lap incident, they always look at it very differently because it's the first lap, and they give some leeway on first lap incidents as opposed to incidents that happen in the rest of the race. Hamilton didn't take the same risk on lap one. Yeah, he didn't take the same risk, but he wasn't anywhere near in the same position either. So there wasn't the reward that there would have been for Alex in the same situation. Let me see. This is why F1 needs fenders, says Cold Forged Cowboy. Agreed to penalty. I'll tell you what, let's have a look at the poll, right? Because I asked the poll and the simple question was, what did you think of the incident? Did you agree with the stewards that it was Hamilton's fault and he deserved a penalty? Did you think it was Albon's fault that he put himself into too risky a position? Was it a racing incident and no penalty required? Or were you not sure? Those are the four options. This is what came up. Look at that. 60% think it's Hamilton's fault and he deserved the penalty. I'm actually really surprised at that. I thought it would be much more split down the middle. I know it's not a huge split one way, but I thought there'd be a much clearer divide straight down the middle of that. Some people thinking that it was Alex Albon's fault for putting his car into that position. Interesting though, 60% of you think that it was Lewis's fault for not backing out, or that he definitely was predominantly at fault and deserved the penalty. I think it's an interesting one. It says, who's this? Delta 9 says, do the crime, do the time. Look, I do think Lewis absolutely accepts the penalty. He was very gracious after the results. I don't think he had any real complaints on that front. It's one of those that if there hadn't been a penalty, we'd be having a similar argument and they would be similarly split down the middle, I think. It could easily have gone as a racing incident. It could have easily been that Lewis could have damaged his car and tumbled out the race and Alex may have continued. Any of these scenarios could have played out. It just happened to play out the way it did, which is why it looks so bad for Alex, of course, to tumble down the order, and it makes Lewis look even more guilty, perhaps, because of the consequences of the action. There you go. Right, we could talk about this one all day because, I mean, I have been talking about this one all day. My Twitter and Instagram have blown up over the course of the last couple of days. And on that note, I apologise to anyone who sent me a message here on YouTube or on Twitter or Instagram. I normally take great pride in the fact that I will always acknowledge, even just if I'm acknowledging with a like or something, every single comment, but I always try and reply or respond where I can. I haven't been able to do that over the last couple of days. It's just gone so busy, so crazy. So apologies for those, but I do appreciate all the messages, so thank you. Let's have a look at the next question, because I'm going to move on with the next one. We're going to move on to another big talking point over the weekend, and there were so many, and we'll try and cover as many as we can. If you want to talk about something, do let me know as we go through this. But I'm going to move on now to the talking point of Ferrari. Chip Hines, no, that's the one we just had. Hemant Patel says, and this is a absolutely leading question, and I love it, which is why I've put it in. Why is the Ferrari engine so slow compared to last year? Now, I saw Simon Lazenby on Sky interviewing Matteo Binotto, and he was tiptoeing his way through the interview. I don't know if you saw it, trying to get Binotto to sort of open up on the fact that there's been a new ruling on their power unit off the back of the investigation last year. Now they're slow. All the Ferrari powered cars are slow. He didn't quite go in for the kill, Simon, and I messaged him later to say exactly that. It was just crying out for someone to say, Matteo, were Ferrari cheating last year, and is that the reason that they are no longer cheating, that all the Ferrari powered cars are now slow? And I'm going to put my hand up and answer your question, hey man, by saying yes, that is absolutely what I believe. The Ferrari power units were investigated towards the tail end of last season, investigated in the way they operate for various systems. We don't know the exact details because we now know that those details have been kept secret between the FIA and Ferrari. But there was lots of talk, and this is what I believe, is lots of talk around things like ways to bypass the fuel flow sensors by storing fuel in excess fuel lines around the car and then injecting it once it's gone past the flow sensor at a point where you need it. There were talk about tricking the fuel flow sensor into believing that your fuel flow rate was different to the way that it actually was. What's happened at the tail end of last year and the new regulations are that the FIA have put a new third fuel flow sensor, an independent one that only the FIA can access in each car. And look what's happened to Ferrari. They are a long way off the pace on all of the Ferrari powered cars, particularly on the straights. 7/10 of a lap they were losing compared to their own car last year around a circuit that only takes 60 seconds to get round. That's mad. So what I'm going to say is, and I'm quite blunt about this, the new regulations say effectively, or the new interpretation of the regulations that have been clarified, you have to run your power unit in a legal fashion, the way the rules were written. What that tells me is that Ferrari were not running it in a legal fashion last year, and that's clearly where they've got a huge chunk of their performance from. Now, I know that nobody can go on TV and outright bluntly say that, but I'm going to say it right here on YouTube because I cannot believe that anyone doesn't believe that's the case. I'm not here to bash Ferrari. I really would love to see Ferrari back at the front of this fight. You know, they have a huge heritage, history in the sport, a huge amount of investment going in. It's a great organisation, but they're not getting things right at the moment. And and so, hey man, there you go. In my opinion, Ferrari were running an illegally operated power unit last year. This year, they have had to make that legal, and look what performance they've lost off the back of it. Let's discuss. Let's see what you're saying. Let me see. Is it just me, or did the Ferrari engine sound really strange over the weekend? Says Rockphonic. It did actually. A lot of the cars sounded strange. I'm not sure what it is yet, but I think there might have been something to do with the onboard mics, because a few of the cars sounded really horrible, tinny, and just not nice at all. Weren't Ferrari cheating in 2018 too? They were fast back then too. That makes the current engine a remake of the 2018 version, says Anko. Well, this is the debate now, and nobody can really have this debate in the open because the results of the investigation, the FIA investigation, have been kept secret, which is a bizarre scenario in itself. But because we don't know that, we don't know. Let's just say, for argument's sake, Ferrari were cheating back in 2019. How long were they cheating for? How long were they running their power unit in a way that has been deemed illegal? Was that back in 2018? Was it before that? I mean, it opens so many question marks, but one of the things that really surprises me is that once we take away whatever feature they might have had on the car that's now deemed illegal, we've taken that away. Look how far behind the other power unit manufacturers they are. We've been talking over the last few years about how Honda have been the fourth best power unit. Maybe Renault are now the fourth best power unit. It's Ferrari by miles. They are so far off the pace with their power unit. It's embarrassing for a team that has that much resource to put into it. There you go. I'm getting overexcited. Let's take some of your some of your comments on this, because it does infuriate me. It's only cheating if you're caught, says Sundby. Yeah, well, there you go. They have been. Secret settlement was bad, says Warren Samby. Yes, it was. What else have we got? They should be banned from qualifying in 2020. Well, they almost banned themselves from part 3 of qualifying on Saturday, didn't they? I mean, we'll get onto the whole Ferrari performance more generally in a moment. But imagine this Ferrari car on the Baku straights, says Brendan Burke. No, doesn't he? Says that's Varun Sambi again. Absolutely, really good point. This is a really short circuit. Like I say, a 60-second lap. You wait till we get to Monza or Baku, if we end up going to Baku. That car is going to be shown up. And I think to embarrassing levels. And yeah, we've got an update coming in Hungary, but that's an aerodynamic update, which I don't care how good it is not going to make the difference that we saw at the weekend. So they are in trouble, really in trouble. And the other really important part about the power unit side of things, and actually that will bring me on to another question here. Let me see. Oh, that's the Vettel one. Hold on. I think I've got another question about Ferrari. Here we go. Brandon Dorr says, do you think Ferrari's engine will cripple them for the season, or can they really mount a challenge to the top 2 after their new car gets brought to Hungary? I really can't see it, Brandon. This is a power unit update that's, an aero update that's coming. There's no way they can make up a second a lap that they were off the pace with an aero update. There's just no way your aero can be that bad. Certainly not on a Ferrari, as I say, with their resource, their tools, their technology, their people that they've got. It's just impossible. So the other big problem they've got is that the regulations now being so restricted, you know that they've now got this freeze on power unit development. They are screwed, because this power unit they're running right now is now locked in with only one update allowed with a token, with this new token system over the course of 2020, and then one more update, I believe it is, in 2021. They've got a mountain to climb and they just cannot do it. They've got a tiny little step ladder to do it with. There's no way they're going to be able to claw this back, in my opinion, which means their season, and I don't want to call this too early, I know we've only had one race, but they are in trouble, bang in trouble. So there we go. Let's see what you're saying on this. It can't be that bad. See, it can be that bad. See, Williams, yeah. So you're talking about the aero. Yeah, okay, yeah, Williams aero definitely was that bad. Okay, but this is Ferrari. This is Ferrari that have everything at their disposal. Formula One are even throwing cash at them to say, come and play our game, take all these hundreds of millions of dollars and go away and design a fast car. And this is what they've come back with. They've been hampered by the power unit change. They haven't had a chance or time to be able to recover it, presumably because whatever was on that system was so fundamental to the way that it operated previously. It's clearly not just as simple as changing a couple of components. It feels like it must be much more seriously fundamental in the design of the way it operated to me than that. Yes, Ferrari are in trouble, says Jim Pix. They certainly are. Is this why Seb left? He knew the car was crap for 2 years, says Free to Wheel. Well, no, we now know, and let's quickly talk about Seb. We now know that Seb didn't choose to leave. He was told he was leaving. He had his contract. They weren't renewing his contract, and he got told that with a phone call from Matteo Binotto, which is so strange to find that out that way. Communication at Ferrari, well, it's tough, isn't it? It's difficult. Let's go back to that question on Sebastian, because from Neil Roberts, he says, DC said Vettel's spin was a rookie error. Do you think he'll see the season out if he has more of these errors in the next few weeks? And if not, which driver changes could be made to replace him? Interesting topic. Let's get into that one. Sebastian is not in a good place. Yes, he's lost his drive, and that's the key. He lost his drive. He was told he was no longer required at Ferrari. That's a 4-time world champion who's proud of what he's achieved. Yeah, he's made mistakes. He's still a great driver. He hasn't lost all of his talent overnight. But I think what we saw at the weekend was a driver whose head is all over the place with what's going on. The media, of course, were all over that story leading into the weekend. He then finds himself in a car that's a second off the pace, and then his teammate scrapes into Q3 while Sebastian just simply can't. He's shot, I think, up here is my take on all of that. And we've seen Sebastian over the last few years make errors when he becomes under pressure. And I mean, let's just have a little look at this one, because let's see, that's that Ferrari car that we have been saying is just so bad right now. And they are seriously in trouble with that. But let's have a look at this, because this was the incident that Sebastian Vettel was caught up in. And an unbelievable point to make a lunge like that. So seemingly amateur, and I've seen onboard footage to say that the car was undrivable at times, and it did look like that. It was all over the place. The balance was terrible, but that's kind of what you get when you get a really slow car and you have to try and push to catch up. But just look how far he's already locked, how far back he's already locked the brakes and has to take avoiding action. And he's almost spinning by the time he hits Carlos Sainz. Let's not forget the man who replaces him at Ferrari next year. An unbelievable set of circumstances. Matt says he needs to move on now. Binotto lied when he said they decided at the pandemic not to offer Vettel a contract. Sainz was already talking to them back in February. Yeah, and this is the thing. Ferrari's communication has been pretty appalling, really, and it's been like that for a long time. If you look at, I mean, I used to work with Sky Sports, where I dealt with their press officers and their media department, and it was terrible. Of all of the teams, Ferrari were the ones that were always trying to manage the message that was going out in this really weird way, instead of being open and upfront and just letting the message play out itself. They always try to construct a message, and here they've done it again and it's backfired on them. Saying one thing, Sebastian then coming out, throwing them straight under the bus, saying, I'm sorry, that's not how it happened. I got told there was never a contract. I got told over the phone they didn't want me. There was never an offer. We never got into contract negotiations. So a really strange set of circumstances. Kimi back to Ferrari, says Mr. Anderson. Who else have we got here? Let's see. Hello all. It's sad to see Seb like this. It really is sad. Really is sad. And I'd love to see him turn this around. I think he's going to struggle to do that in the car that he's got this year, but I think from a mental perspective, I'd love to see him turn it around, get back on top of it, because even if he can't get any great results this season, and let's not forget, Charles managed to pull his car up to P2, and I know through bizarre circumstances, but if it can be done, Seb could be there to pick up pieces on occasions, but only if he's in the right headspace. So that's the thing I'd love to see him turn around, get back on top of this, let the driving do the talking for him. That would be great, wouldn't it? Let me see. Seb is lacking identity. For many times before, he wanted to act and be like Kimi. Lacking identity, I'm not sure. He's a quiet character. That's absolutely fine, of course, to be a quiet character. He's going to lack identity by the end of this season if he ends up making more and more mistakes like this, or his identity won't be the one that he deserves it to be. And that's perhaps more the point. The bigger story, in my opinion, is Ferrari to IndyCar. What are your thoughts with that? That is Omologato. Oh, hey, how you doing, Shami? So, lots of talk about that. Ferrari have spoken publicly about potentially looking into going to IndyCar. They actually did it the story broke off the back of the need to start bringing the numbers of employees down when the budget cap kicks in from next year onwards. They don't want to lose their staff, and maybe they could redeploy staff and resources on IndyCar. And it sounds like those conversations have gone a bit further. They are having seemingly much bigger talks around that, which I think is fantastic. I would really love to see that happen. I mean, yes, all of their experience in top level motorsport is mostly in Formula One right now, isn't it? But why not go out to Indy and make a name for themselves? Huge marketplace for them to promote the brand. And look, Formula One, it's becoming sour. The relationship between Formula One and Ferrari has soured over recent years to some extent. I mean, not entirely. Look, they're still a great brand, a great team. I would still love to see them have success in Formula One. But why not go make a fresh start somewhere else with another prong to their attack in IndyCar? I think that with the resource they have, they could go on and put a proper challenge in and do a proper job. And I'd love to see it. I'm not a huge follower yet of IndyCar. I was supposed to be going, in fact, with Shami, Mr. Omologato, to the Indy 500 back in May, which of course didn't happen. So I'm devastated about that. But I'm just starting to get an interest in it. And look, it's racing. So I love racing. So I will start to follow it more closely. This is why Ferrari were supporting the reverse grid. Yeah, I mean, Ferrari, I think Ferrari would love a reverse grid right now, wouldn't they? But that's not what they really intended it for. Do you think the Mercedes, right, Mercedes, let's get on to Mercedes, okay? A couple of questions coming in about Mercedes. Let's just quickly, before we move on to that, because the question there was, if Seb doesn't finish the season, and let's not rule that out, okay? That could either happen because Sebastian has had enough, either the relationship goes sour or he just cannot face getting in that car again, or he makes too many mistakes and Ferrari say, look, this isn't working, we want to put someone else in the car. Who's it going to be? Now, their reserve driver, official reserve driver, is Giovinazzi at Alfa Romeo. I don't think he's necessarily thought of yet as Ferrari material in terms of being a preferred race driver, but if they're going to write the season off in terms of a championship, maybe if they get to this point, and I know this is very early stages, I'm certainly not saying Sebastian Vettel should be replaced, but if we go through the season and it gets to that stage, the most likely scenario is Antonio Giovinazzi moving up to Ferrari and then Robert Kubica slotting into the Alfa Romeo. That's how it would work on paper. Right, let's move on to Mercedes because, well, this thing was just unbelievably, blisteringly fast over the weekend. And, I mean, my goodness, it's to the point where I just cannot understand how anyone else is going to even get close to this car. This is just unbelievable. Let me just bring up this question from Simon White, who says, great race and love your videos. Why do you think Marc didn't let Lewis pass Bottas for the last lap? Do you think Lewis wasn't quick enough at that stage with the sensor issues, etc., to hold off Lando's charge? I pulled that question up too early, but I just want to finish what I'm saying about the Mercedes. That car, is so quick. Like I said earlier, this is a circuit, the shortest lap time on the entire Formula One calendar, just over 60 seconds, and yet they managed to be half a second quicker than anybody else over a qualifying lap. As I said before, a second quicker than Ferrari. I think if we'd had a boring standard race with no safety cars, no incidents, I suspect the Mercedes could have lapped most of the field. They were that quick, and I know they had their issues, and we will talk about Simon's question right now, but they have some fragility still. But in terms of pace, this is terrifying for the rest of the field, in that they were confident coming into this season. The torque was confident. They were bringing upgrades to all sorts of areas of the car. Just look at the result. This is the perfect example of how a Formula One team should operate, not just this season, over the past few seasons. I'm in awe of what they've achieved. You know, having worked in a Formula One team, you know, this is the sort of thing you dream of, is constantly improving every single time you go out, every single time you bring a new car, even when you're at what you feel like is the pinnacle of your performance level, to find something else. That's the sign of an incredible team, an amazing set of people that have pulled together under the leadership of Toto Wolff. You stick a couple of great drivers in it, and that's an unbeatable combination, in my opinion, this year. There's no reason they could not win every single race, however many we end up having, as long as the thing holds together. Which brings us to this question from Simon White, who says, yeah, great race. Do you think, sorry, that's not about the reliability. This is at the end of the race, and we will come to the reliability. At the end of the race, this is the one mistake I think Mercedes made on Sunday. It was not switching Bottas and Lewis at the end when Lewis got his 5-second penalty. And I know there were nursing issues, but Simon, to answer your question, I think they just missed a trick, if I'm honest. I don't think that they thought Lewis wasn't quick enough. I feel like Lewis was more than quick enough. I felt like both cars, still even nursing their sensors and keeping off the nursing their gearboxes and keeping off the curbs, I still felt they had so much pace in hand. They could have put Lewis in front, managed the gap back to Lando to make sure that they could have still held on to that. It would have been second place, wouldn't it, with Lewis and Valtteri? They could have still walked away with a much better result than the one that they came away with if they'd managed that final situation better. Valtteri would have still won the race when the penalty was applied, but they could have brought Lewis up closer to the front as well, in my opinion. Let's see what you guys are saying on all of this. Why didn't the gearbox fail? Well, it didn't fail because it managed to hang on to the end of the race. But if you believe Mercedes, they say it was this close to failing. And there is another question actually around the, let's see where it is, around the, here we go, around the gearbox. How does staying off the curbs help prevent a gearbox from failing? Are they that fragile in heat that vibrations will damage the sensors? From Frank Valoria. Thanks, Frank. This is a sensor issue inside the gearbox, and somebody else asked me, how can a sensor stop the gearbox from working? These gearboxes now are as complicated as the engine. They are mind-bogglingly complicated when you look inside one, and a lot of it is operated via sensors. So there are positional sensors to manage the position of various shafts. There are pressure sensors, of course. Some of these kind of things, if you get a failure, you know, the system will go into a default which will effectively ruin your race. It might shut down to protect the gearbox, given that we get these grid penalties now for having to change them. So they are critical. And the curbs around this particular circuit were so brutal, or are so brutal, and the damage was done early in the race where the sensors inside, which are fragile, I mean, they shouldn't be this fragile, obviously, but they are sensitive pieces of delicate kit, were obviously shaken to bits quite early on. And I think what was happening was Mercedes was seeing spikes or noise, as we call it, on the trace from those sensors. So instead of being a clean line measuring whatever it's measuring on the trace of the data, it must have had noise, it must have had spikes on it, which shows you that it's starting to become faulty. And when you get that, it's only a matter of time before failure happens. And if it's a critical sensor, it can be a terminal failure in terms of your car having to stop. So they shouldn't be that delicate, but of course this is perhaps the most extreme circuit we go to, and it just happens to have been the very first one we go to this particular year. Mercedes has drama at every race and nothing happens, says Mike T. Well, the skeptics will say, and I have seen this a lot, the skeptics will say there was nothing wrong with the gearbox, they were just trying to slow the drivers down to nurse the cars around to the end of the race, or to not make the lead embarrassingly big, so as to think about the bigger picture of how Formula One's perceived. I don't buy that. I do believe it was an issue. I do believe that, you know, these things can happen. And actually you'd be amazed, and this is another thing from my own experience, you'd be amazed how many races cars get to the end of, and yet when you get it back, something is on the brink of failing, even if you haven't seen it in the data. I mean, I remember a race, I think it was Magny-Cours, where I was working with Kimi. I remember we had a brake issue with Kimi coming towards the end of the end of the race. He was leading the race by miles, and yet he was still pushing, doing fastest laps, and we were telling him to slow down because we knew there was a brake issue, i.e. the brakes were wearing out. He only has one setting, Kimi, which is flat out. We got to the end of the race, which he won, I think, if I'm right in saying. He pulled the car back into Parc Fermé, and as the car rolled to its standstill, the brake disc fell to pieces into the bottom of the rim, and I was stood there, watched it. I couldn't believe my eyes. If it had happened 200 metres, you know, what, a lap earlier, before he'd done his cool-down lap, game over. We wouldn't have finished the race, let alone won it. And so you'd be amazed how many scenarios like that happen, where you find out afterwards that you were that close to not finishing because something was about to fail or something had been damaged. So it's not uncommon, it's just that we heard this over the radio because it was something that they thought they could do something about by communicating to the drivers to get them to stay off the curbs. That's my take on it all. Here we go. They'll have to use the same gearboxes next week, won't they? Says Minestrone, a Mini Strone. They will have to use the same gearboxes next week. But there's nothing to say there's actually a problem with the gearbox. They could change the sensor in the gearbox under supervision from the FIA if it's faulty, and assuming the gearbox isn't damaged itself, they can run that again with the same, with a new sensor on board. Of course, what they need to try and do is work out a way of preventing these sensors from failing, and that is exactly what they will be doing right now. Back in Brackley and of course at the circuit, they'll be looking at any means they can with the suppliers of those sensors, with the mounting of those sensors, anything they can do to try and prevent that happening again, they'll be doing for sure. What can be done to save the gearboxes next week? Well, that's it. That's all they can do really, is exactly identify why it's happened and then try and find a fix. Lots of people have said to me, how about all this reliability? Can we fix it for next race? Well, it depends what it is, obviously. Some can, some just simply won't be able to. And I think we'll talk about that more in a moment. Let me see. What was the reason for 2 Merc engined cars retired, says Jean Cartier. I believe it was overheating, wasn't it? I think I'm right in saying on the Racing Point at least. I think it was an overheating issue. I think, but I'm not quite sure. Can't remember on the Racing Point. Right, let's see. They could buy the Williams gearbox. Yeah, they could do. I don't think there's much wrong with their gearbox. I think it simply feels like this sensor issue. And if they can fix that, they are good to go. And as I say, let's not forget, this is the most brutal of all the circuits that we're going to go to. If they can fix it here for next week, they are home and dry for the rest of the season, in theory, with that one. Right, let's see what other questions I've got here, and then we'll get some of yours from this evening. Freddie Junker says, what exactly do teams mean when they talk about sensor issues? Do they mean a sensor might fail, or that a sensor is detecting critical forces? Why does a sensor failing automatically lead to a retirement? Sorry, Freddie, I meant to bring your question up before I said what I just said. Hopefully I've answered it already, in that some of those sensors control critical things within the gearbox, and if they fail, it can either shut down or can just cause critical problems. And actually, you might think, well, surely they've got backups. Actually, lots of these sensors do have backup systems, and you may have heard the engineer talking to the driver saying, right, chassis default 5.2, I think it might have been, as an urgent situation, and some of those commands you hear are to go to a backup sensor or a backup system. exactly for that very reason, to try and prevent that. So there are ways to overcome it or to recover it, but it sounds like for Mercedes that didn't necessarily work. Okay, what else have we got here? We have got this one from Dr. Matt, who says, are we likely to see such carnage in terms of unreliability again this weekend, given the short turnaround? Well, that's an interesting one. I think probably not, and the reason we won't is because the carnage or the unreliability we had is a massive warning sign to every team. You know, it's the sort of thing you hope you get in, if you're going to get it, in pre-season testing, because then you've seen it, you can address it, and therefore it shouldn't occur in a race. Well, we saw it here this week, and that's the trigger that should say to them, right, we need to fix this particular problem, and therefore let's hopefully get a cleaner race this weekend. Some teams, depending on what their unreliability was, just simply won't be able to do that. There might be a fundamental flaw somewhere that means they can't fix it in the time they got available, and the answer to that, perhaps, is to stay off the curbs or to drive more slowly, to run the engine in a lower power mode, for example, for more of the race. They will compromise performance to ensure reliability if they can't come up with a fix. That's just the nature of this really rapid series of races that we got coming. So it is going to be tricky. I don't expect the same level of unreliability, but you just don't know, because they are coming so fast. There is a limited amount that people can do. Let me see, did anyone take new parts after the race? I don't know, that's Deftones DSM. I don't know the answer to that one about any new parts. We'll find that out on Thursday this coming week, because that's when the cars get scrutineered, that's when the teams have to lodge their components or log their components with the FIA, things like power units, things like gearboxes, chassis, anything else. Those components, or components of the power units, will be logged with the FIA on Thursday of this week, so that's when we'll find out. Let me see, what else have we got? Haas would need new brakes. Both failed. At least their problems are consistent across the cars. The Haas thing it's becoming a bit of a joke, isn't it? Brakes on a Haas. They say they overheated, but I mean, come on, that's pretty basic stuff. They're seriously hampered with budget and new components, you know, with the Haas team, and maybe they are running components from last year's car. I don't know, but they've got to get on top of that, if for no other reasons than that it's a massive safety issue, apart from the fact that they're not finishing races as a result. So yeah, that's a big problem for that one. Does Carlos Sainz regret his move to Ferrari? He won't regret this. Lots of people have asked me that as well recently. He won't regret his move to Ferrari because it's a dream move, and it doesn't look good right now. It probably won't look good for 2021 either, if we're really honest, given the freeze on technology that we've got between now and then. But longer term than that, you know, 2022, the next generation of Formula One, you've got to say that a team like Ferrari must be in one of the best positions with the resource they have to be able to come up with a car for 22 that's competitive at least. And that's where I think, you know, Carlos Sainz will have to be starting to set his sights pretty quickly. 2021 might be a year to settle into the team. Who knows how much they can drag out of that car by then, but it's not looking great for Ferrari, is it? So yeah, it may well be that his McLaren does far better than the Ferrari that he'll be in next year. Let's go on to this question from Jonty's Corner. Says, do you think we'll see any different strategies next week, even when the tyre compounds are the same? And that's an interesting one. And the big one that I can see will be an obvious strategy difference, perhaps, is going through qualifying on the medium tyre, like Max Verstappen did. He kind of caught everyone out. He kind of took the gamble that no one else was prepared to do this week just gone. And it would have stood him really well, I think, in the race, enabling him to run much longer in that first stint. Well, that element of surprise has now gone. That's no longer the gamble that it was seen as first time around, because he was able to do it reasonably comfortably. And I think if he can do it, the Mercedes can definitely do it. And I would expect, I mean, look, let's look at the Mercedes. They can pretty much do anything, and I still think they can win this race with, you know, first and second with both cars. But if they're going to optimise, which is what they will be trying to do, optimise their performance, I can see them going onto the medium tyre Maybe they'll split the strategies, I don't know. But I do think that's one of the things that might change, because people have seen it, they've seen it work or potentially work for Max, and that's one thing that perhaps is less of a gamble in the second week than it was in the first week. Other than that, strategies probably not too much different. It's a one-stop race no matter how you look at it, and the two options really are starting on the soft and then going to the hard, or starting on the medium, running longer and having a shorter stint on the hard. Some people actually work better on the harder tyre in those conditions. So if conditions are similar, it might be that some people will prefer to have a longer stint on the hard tyre if it suited their car in the first weekend. But interesting point. Let's take some of yours. Mercedes will qualify with intermediates. yeah, that would be good, wouldn't it? I mean, they probably could. Let me see. Max to Mercedes in the future if Red Bull doesn't give him a #1 car. He's locked in, isn't he, for quite a while at Red Bull, Max Verstappen. But beyond that, I mean, just who knows? The Red Bull's not a bad car. Let's be clear about that. The Red Bull has not taken a giant leap forward, but taken a small step forward from last year, which is always a positive. And I think Max said he didn't get the balance right over this weekend. So maybe there's still time to be found in that particular package. But let's face it, there were still two opportunities that Red Bull could have won that race on Sunday. One was with Alex, with that switch to the soft tyres. If he'd got past Hamilton, who knows whether he could have even won that race with the two limping Mercedes out front. And the other, of course, was Max on that alternate strategy. Again, with hampered Mercedes up front, could he have done something a bit different? So it's not a write-off for Red Bull at this point, but they are not in the same league as Mercedes, that is for sure. Right. James Ward Gillam says, was Kimi's tyre failure down to a poor pit stop, or was it a part failure as the team were not fined for an unsafe release and tyres usually come off quickly if not placed correctly? Well, there it is. That was a fairly significant wheel, wasn't it, for Kimi? It would have caught him by surprise, and the energy that was spinning through that tyre as it came off was terrifying. Thank goodness there was nobody in the crowd, and I don't think it got that far in the end, but some people were saying, I mean, the commentators were even talking, surprisingly, about why the tethers hadn't kicked in. The tethers are only attached to the upright of the car. So in an accident, when the suspension, the carbon fibre suspension components break, the wheel and the upright comes off. It's the tether then that bolts the upright to the chassis and stops it flying around. In this situation, it was actually a cross-threaded wheel nut, which means that when the gun goes on, the nut's already in the wheel, so the wheel goes over the upright, the gun then jams over the wheel nut and spins it up. There's a massive chamfer on the front of the, on the nut, on the wheel nut, and a corresponding massive chamfer on the hub or the axle, and a massively coarse thread, so that it's very hard to cross-thread those nuts. If you imagine putting the lid back on your bottle of milk, if you've got a screw-top bottle of milk, you can sometimes wind it on and it nips up because it's not quite sitting properly on the threads. That's cross-threading, and it's very hard to do on a Formula 1 car because the thread is so coarse, so thick. There's only about 3 turns of entire engagement on the wheel nut before it's fully done up. So it's very hard to cross-thread it, but on the rare occasion that it happens, it can be serious. Because when you do the gun up, it nips up just like your bottle on the top of your milk bottle. It goes tight. It can feel like the nut's done up. The torque sensor on the gun can feel like there's enough torque gone into doing that up. You get your little light on the gun, and the guy that's operating that, if he doesn't notice that the wheel's not sitting properly, his hand goes up or his light goes on, and away the car goes, and that's what happened. So the wheel nut, although it felt tight to the gunman, it wasn't on properly, and by the time he'd done a few laps and started to build his speed up as they were coming out of the safety car period, the forces became much greater, of course. As he started to wind it up, it popped the nut off, and then the wheel came off. And because the wheel came off the upright, there's no tether to attach the wheel to the upright. That's the job of the wheel nut. But when the wheel nuts disappeared down the road, there is nothing left to hold the wheel on, and that's why it came off. But my God, the rotation, the energy in that, and there's a big chunk spinning down the road. That's terrifying, that is. Let me see. Kimmy, what the fuck happened to my front? There's another Kimmy impression for you, another terrible one. You've heard it before, it hasn't got any better. What is the function of, I've talked about sensors in gearboxes. What would happen to the guy on the wheel? Dylan Wheater, that's a good question. What happens to the guy on that wheel gun in the pit stop? And the truth is, well, he doesn't get sacked, he doesn't get punished, it's not like that. He has to now be central to the process of making sure it can't happen again, because nobody knows better what happened than him. And of course they have overhead cameras, they have all sorts of sensors and data that they'll collect from every pit stop. They can go into that, look at it back in super slow motion, they can work out exactly what happened if he doesn't already know. And perhaps they need to make modifications to the hardware, or maybe it's a process that they need to make sure they change or are aware of in that pit stop. So he will be there again this weekend. He will be central to the rebuilding process. You know, win and lose as a team. It's a bit of a cliche, but it's absolutely true when it comes to Formula One. He won't be being punished for that scenario. It's a mistake, and I promise you, nobody will feel worse than that guy. Let me see. Thoughts on the update package that Red Bull brought for just one car, says Mux B. Interesting. I think they actually brought it for both cars, didn't they? But then Max went off and damaged some bits on Friday. And because Max is the one, the bits that perhaps Alex did have on Friday got taken off him and moved over to Max's side of the garage. And you can say that's harsh and perhaps it's unfair. There is no real mistake to be made that Red Bull are absolutely favouring Max this year. I don't think even they would try and pretend that they're not. They don't think Alex is ready to mount a championship challenge yet. They want Max Verstappen to be world champion, to be the youngest ever world champion. He can only do that this year. All of the talk at Red Bull has been about getting Max to a world championship. And so whatever they have to do, it's a little bit like the old Ferrari days of Schumacher. They will be throwing everything they can behind Max. That doesn't mean they're going to stop Alex Albon from winning a race or to have a great result. And if with Max out the race on Sunday, if Alex had got past Lewis, then everything would have been thrown at getting Alex to the lead, to the front of that Grand Prix. But when there's only one of something, it is definitely going to be going to Max this year, that is for sure. Right, let me see. We've got a couple of minutes left. Let's see what other questions we've got here. I think I've got a couple more. Adam Nagy says, what will happen to the mechanic? Oh, there we go. Keep doing this. What will happen to the mechanic that put on Kimi's right front tyre? Sorry, Adam, I've already answered it. But there you go. I have already answered it. He will be absolutely fine. Actually, the biggest thing that can happen in that situation is that as a mechanic who's had that incident, you feel so bad that actually it can get to you up here. And I've seen people at McLaren, you know, have to have counselling off the back of an incident like that, where it's cost them a Grand Prix, and you feel like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. You feel like all of the supporters of that team, of that driver, are looking at you, are staring at you, are pointing fingers at you. And of course, most of them aren't, but that's how you feel. So psychologically, it can be a massive blow, and that's maybe one of the hardest things that he has to find a way to overcome. Georgie139 says, how much running do you think we'll see in the practice sessions this coming weekend? Will the teams want to risk damage or wear on the cars with presumably very little to learn? That's a good point. I think we'll see less running for sure on Friday if the conditions are predicted to be the same. And at the moment, it looks like conditions could be a bit changeable over this weekend, maybe even wet at times. Now, if that is the case going into Saturday and Sunday, they will have to start looking into that, and they will have to start looking and factoring that into their race runs or their race setup on the car, those kind of things. But in general, I think we're going to see a lot less running. Yes, to save engines and gearboxes and wear and tear on the car. Also though, because we kind of have a huge amount of data. Fridays are all about collecting data. We've got more data than we have for any other, and this is relevant data, that we have at any other circuit we ever go to that's happened just a week ago. So I suspect that the teams that need to try out their reliability fixes, they'll all be running, of course. The teams that want to try something different on the car, they can definitely use it to put into practice the things they learnt over the course of Saturday and Sunday last weekend. I don't think we'll see nobody going out on circuit. Nobody's going to take that risk, but I don't think we'll see the standard amount of running that we otherwise would, just simply because engines and gearboxes, as we saw last weekend, are not bulletproof and have to last for quite a long time these days. Right, that's all the ones that I picked. So 5 minutes to go. We'll finish it on top of the hour. Let's take a couple of yours. Do you think Red Bull has DAS, says Dylan Wheater? That's a good question. I do think they will definitely be working on it, or have worked on it. And I put a tweet out at the weekend which gained quite a lot of interest from a lot of people, saying that, you know, if you think back, Red Bull used their current car in a filming day, didn't they, at Silverstone? Unlike many of the other teams who used an old car to do unlimited running to get everybody back into the swing of things, Red Bull, yes, they were trying some other different aero parts on the car too, so perhaps that was the reason. But I did wonder, with the protest that went in over the weekend, were they trialling a DAS system on that Red Bull car during their filming day just to prove out the system, just in case this protest went the way that it did, proves that it's legal, and Red Bull now feel that they need to have one to be able to compete at the front. I definitely think they will have been doing some work on it, but it's not an easy thing to integrate afterwards. Red Bull have designed this thing over the last couple of years, probably, based the design of the chassis, based the design of the rest of the car around having this tool on board. To try and do it afterwards, particularly with the setup Red Bull have, although I don't think it's impossible, must be more difficult and less effective than the way that Mercedes have gone about doing it. So we will have to wait and see. There we go. What else have we got? Do you think Renault can compete with McLaren and Racing Point? Says Vagelis Caravalos. Can Renault compete? On the face of it, doesn't look like it, does it? Renault are in a difficult situation. They have got a chassis that kind of was carried over from last year. So it's a 2019 chassis that they carried over to 2020, thinking that that might save them a bit of time and money while they focus on the new regulations which were coming in for 2021. That set of regs have now been pushed back to 22, and the chassis have all been frozen, which means that Renault have to run their 2019 chassis for 2019, 2020 and 2021 now. Now, that may not be the biggest detriment in the world because you can change a lot of the bits around it, but it's definitely not ideal. And I think they're going to struggle off the back of it. They're also going to be hurt by the fact they lose a customer team next year. Therefore, they lose half the amount of data that they're currently getting around their power unit. Things are not looking great in the sort of medium term, short to medium term for Renault. They could find a good result in that midfield, but it feels to me like Racing Point and McLaren, and let's finish on McLaren, feels like they've taken a step ahead of Renault, and that could continue over the course of this season. Let's finish on talking about my old team, particularly Lando Norris. What an amazing, amazing result for him. I was so proud of them all, so pleased to see them celebrate in the garage. For lots of that team, they have never experienced a race win. They've never experienced a great result to that level. And you could see that from the emotion in the garage. I was very lucky. I walked into McLaren back in 2000 when they were already a front-running car. We were expected to win races every week, and if we didn't, it was disappointing. The current crop at McLaren haven't been lucky enough to experience those times yet. They've had really difficult times, in fact. And so to see the emotion pouring out of everyone in that garage on Sunday was just brilliant. I had a huge grin on my face. And Lando Norris's last lap, wow, unbelievable. How did he pull that out of the bag? Fastest lap as well, just brilliant. That last lap was magic, says Redmond Barry. Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Renault could get Ferrari as a customer. Love it. Seidel is a huge addition to the team, says Tony Roberts. Yeah, seems to be very, very good. Really nice guy, really sensible, level-headed guy. I think he'll be a great addition. Milkman gets podium. Absolutely. McLaren did good, but it did come at the expense of Red Bull, though further podiums are not out of the question. Yeah, we all know that the result that McLaren got was as a result of some of the attrition that happened in the race. Absolutely, not even McLaren are pretending otherwise. But that's what you have to be there for in those situations. The fact that half the field didn't get to the end is an achievement in itself, to say that you got there and in the condition to be pulling out the fastest lap of the race on the last lap of the race. Let's not take anything away from what McLaren achieved. It's brilliant. The trajectory they're on is in an upward direction, and I have great hopes for the future. On that note, guys, it is 10 o'clock here in the UK, so I want to say a massive thank you. We could literally go on for another hour. We haven't covered half of the talking points from yesterday's Grand Prix. I will try and cover some more. I'll be back with videos this week. Tomorrow I'm doing a radio show for Talk Radio where it's all about cars. On Wednesday I've got the brand new electric Porsche coming to make a video. Can't wait for that. And loads more over the course of this week. And then before you know it, we're back into cars on circuit again in just a few days' time. How awesome is that? Formula One's back. See you guys. Thanks ever so much. See you soon. Thanks for tuning in. Ta-ra.